transaction works, I changed the title of this slide to typical document flow, but it's also a schematic of how all of the money and contracts work in an international trade transaction. We start off here with a price quotation. Initially, the potential buyer will send a request to the potential seller, something that says, please quote best price, best delivery for some kind of product. The seller then will come back to the buyer with a price quotation. They'll negotiate that. Presuming that the buyer wishes to buy, they'll then offer bring up a purchase order. The purchase order always says the time is of the essence of this contract. The seller doesn't want to necessarily agree to that, so they issue then a sales contract in response. So now at least the buyer and the seller are agreeing on the price, the quantity, the Incoterm, etc. If the sales term is for payment by letter of credit, then the seller will open up a letter of credit in favor of the buyer. Shipment takes place somewhere in there. A bill of lading is issued by the carrier. Transaction moves through the hands of the freight forwarder and customs broker. Eventually, when the bill of lading is issued, the seller sends it to the bank with appropriate documents, and the payment is made. Of course, there are a lot of nuances in there, but that's the overall schematic. In commercial transactions, that is in the contracts, we have 4 players, as you can see. We have the buyer and the seller, of course. The buyer has a bank, it's called the issuing bank. The seller has a bank called the advising bank. The relationship between the buyer and the seller is summarized in this way. In the first step, the seller will provide that quotation to the buyer, that is our best price, our best delivery. The buyer then issues the purchase order to the seller. The seller issues the sales contract to the buyer, and that sales contract will include the shipping and delivery details, the terms of the payment, any required documentation, and anything else that is pertinent to this particular order. Separately, in the commercial contract, the buyer will, let's see, I hope you guys can see my pointer, I don't know. The buyer will open up a credit relationship with the issuing bank, that is the buyer's bank, if the buyer needs cash in order to pay their obligations for this transaction. Likewise, the seller on the right side has a relationship with its bank, also called the advising bank. They may need credit to make production of the products that they're going to sell to the buyer. So they may need working capital, and eventually all 4 parties will need relationships so that the money can transfer properly. The issuing bank and the advising bank have what's called a correspondent relationship, so that they, on behalf of their clients, can move documents and move money back and forth. There we go. So we talked a little bit about the basis of commercial contracts, and you can see that we did not discuss Incoterms in there other than to say that an Incoterm is part of the price that's negotiated. And I'm moving quickly because we burned some time with our technical difficulties. So if you didn't catch something that you wanted to catch, just type a question into the browser box and I'll answer it for you. Next, we're going to move into understanding something about letters of credit. Moving ahead. So, looking at various kinds of payments and methods of payments, we can see that the most secure, well, just a moment, you'll see that the way I've put this together is that we're competing the most secure transaction for the seller with what's easier for the seller. And so at the other end of the spectrum, which is down at the bottom, that which is less secure for the seller is easier for the buyer. So, for example, the first line, cash in advance, the seller is quite secure. They won't even manufacture the goods or make them available until they're paid in advance. It's easier for them, but it's more difficult for the buyer. Next, we move ahead to letter of credit, which is a typical way that international trade has been done for hundreds of years. Remember that in this case, the buyer will open a letter of credit in favor of the seller. When the seller ships according to the term in the letter of credit, that's usually when the seller is paid. A little bit of a more flexible way on letters of credit would be a documentary collection where after cargo is shipped, the seller can simply submit documents to the bank asking for payment. And of course, the easiest way for a seller is to receive an open account, and then the buyer, the seller will simply give them an invoice and say, please pay us. Of course, that's the riskiest proposition for the seller. Basically reviewing letters of credit, because it's tied into Incoterms, the basic types of letters of credit are the first one here, the irrevocable letter of credit. The second one being a letter of credit, which by name means it's revocable or can be pulled back, and in terms of international trade really isn't worth very much to the seller, because if the buyer wishes to revoke it, then the seller has no guarantee of payment. And the last item here we sometimes see is a standby letter of credit. The seller will agree to sell an open account as long as there is a standby letter of credit in the background, so that if the buyer doesn't pay on time, then the seller can go ahead and be paid by the standby letter of credit. There's really no difference between the standby letter of credit and the first one, the irrevocable letter of credit, other than an agreement between the buyer and the seller that the standby letter of credit will not be used until a certain circumstance happens when the buyer doesn't pay the seller on time. Letters of credit are defined by, or the what will be shipped, looking for my pointer, what will be shipped, when it will be shipped, to where and from where it will be shipped, the price and term of payment and also Incoterm, certain expiration dates, and what kind of documents need to be included. For instance, in document required, we see typical first document is what's called a clean onboard negotiable bill of lading. It's basically a claim check for the cargo. Whoever has the bill of lading could theoretically go to the port when the cargo is at the port, present the bill of lading, and take the cargo. So it's a very valuable document. The letter of credit also says that it will be paid when it is presented to the bank together with the proper documentation. That documentation could well include these other different types of document: the invoice, a packing list, or maybe multiple copies of an invoice and multiple copies of a packing list. Sometimes a certificate of origin, or a consular certificate of origin, or a certificate of origin authorized by a Chamber of Commerce. These are typical documents. There are sometimes more of them that are required. So we have seen these 4 boxes in the previous presentation of the contract arrangement. We see them again here. So looking at the process of how the payment is made after the contract is agreed to, we can see we start off with the first step. That is, after the contract is made and agreed to between the buyer and the seller, let's assume, for this example, that the buyer has agreed to pay the seller by letter of credit, and that the seller has agreed to accept the buyer's letter of credit as payment. And so, first step is that the buyer will apply to open a letter of credit with their bank, that is the issuing bank. If the bank agrees, then the bank will issue the letter of credit in favor of the seller, but the movement of the piece of paper, or these days an electronic message, would be from the issuing bank to the advising bank, and then the advising bank will advise the seller that it has received the letter of credit in its favor. When the seller is satisfied that the document is in place and that they'll be paid, the seller then will ship the goods to the buyer. We just moved ahead one slide. And let me use a different pointer tool so that I can show you this. This slide is a little bit busier. So in the last slide, the seller shipped the goods to the buyer. What happens next is over here. Hope you can all see that. The seller then presents those documents to the bank through usually through their customs broker. Not always, but usually so, or frequently so. And those documents, as we just looked at in the previous slides, which would be the letter of credit, an invoice, packing slip, and any certificate of origin or other similar documents. They present those documents to their bank, which is the advising bank. The advising bank then moves the document